Sarah laughed and yanked the scarf, my grandmother's scarf, from my neck, tossing it into the grass. In that moment, laughter rippled through the party, erasing years of tradition as it carried on. I didn't cry. I didn't I walked inside, retrieved her phone, and slipped it into my purse. Like my scarf, she would learn what it means to lose control. Because this wasn't just about a piece of fabric. It was about identity. And I was done disappearing. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. It was meant to be a family celebration, but when my daughter-in-law Sarah ripped off my scarf and mocked my traditions, it shattered everything. The garden was lit with fairy lights, strung between trimmed hedges, and laughter floated through the twilight air like bubbles on champagne. Marianne stood near the outdoor buffet, holding a glass of water she hadn't touched, the scent of rosemary lamb and grilled peaches clinging to the breeze. She'd spent 2 hours choosing her outfit, settling on a simple navy blouse and the scarf her grandmother had passed down to her, the one she wore only on the most meaningful occasions. It was delicate now, worn at the edges, embroidered by hand, generations ago. Her mother used to say, "We wear our roots like armor." Marianne had believed in that once, until Sarah, "Is that part of the outfit?" Sarah's voice cut through the chatter, loud enough to draw attention, sharp enough to draw blood. Marianne turned, her hand instinctively rising to her scarf. "It's family tradition," she said quietly, steadying her voice. "It's worn for—" "Oh, come on," Sarah laughed. "You're not still clinging to those superstitions, are you? You're too old for that." She reached forward suddenly, and before Marianne could react, Sarah tugged the scarf loose, letting it flutter to the grass. The laughter around them didn't grow louder, but it didn't stop either. A beat of silence, then someone, maybe Chris, maybe one of Sarah's friends, snickered. Glasses clinked, conversations resumed, carefully ignoring the wound that had just opened in the center of the party. Marianne bent slowly, picked up the scarf with fingers that trembled. She didn't say a word. Sarah was already walking away, her champagne sloshing with each confident step, her voice trailing off in a joke about outdated customs and clingy mothers-in-law. Marianne stood still, everything slowed. The lights blurred at the edges, her pulse drummed in her throat like a war song. She looked around and realized no one, not one person, had come to her defense. Not Chris, not her sister-in-law, not even her own granddaughter, who had once braided Marianne's hair and asked about the women in the old family photos. She had always known Sarah didn't like her, but this was public degradation, a quiet, exquisite humiliation. Marianne clutched the scarf to her chest and walked toward the far end of the garden, away from the crowd, past the hydrangeas in bloom and the string of lights that flickered in the wind. She sat on a stone bench hidden behind the arbor, her heart hammering, her eyes dry. No tears came, only heat. Because this wasn't just about a scarf. It was about years of being asked to bring the dessert, but never being offered a chair. About cleaning up after dinners, while Sarah scrolled on her phone. About biting her tongue through smirks and subtle digs, through gift rejections and calendar exclusions. It was about being made small, and tonight they had made it official. She wasn't the matriarch, she was the tolerated relic. Until now. Marianne smoothed the scarf across her lap, the threads catching moonlight. Her grandmother's stitching still held firm. She thought of every woman in her line who had worn it, and she made a decision. No more asking for respect. No more waiting for kindness. Marianne stood, her spine straighter than it had been in years. The garden was behind her, laughter carrying on like nothing had happened, like she was nothing. But that was about to change. She walked toward the house, past the tables, past the flickering candles. Sarah was wrong. This scarf wasn't about tradition. It was about identity. And she was done letting anyone strip that away. Marianne opened the front door quietly and stepped inside, not to escape the party, but to begin planning, because next time they saw her, she wouldn't be silent, she would be in control. This wasn't just about the scarf, it was about reclaiming my power and making Sarah feel what I felt. The hallway inside the house was cool and hushed, a quiet contrast to the party still buzzing outside. Marianne stood for a long moment, just inside the door, her scarf wound tight in her hands. She could still hear Sarah laughing from the garden, sharp and bright like broken glass. She moved slowly down the corridor, past old family photos on the wall, Chris as a boy, toothless and beamed. A beach trip. A Christmas morning. She paused at one, the photo of her and her husband, on their wedding day. She looked young then, unapologetically proud. A woman who hadn't yet learned the art of shrinking. Her fingers grazed the frame. Enough, she whispered. The party rolled on outside. Laughter. Music. The scrape of forks on fine china. But in the dining room just off the patio, the table sat momentarily abandoned, champagne glasses sweating in the summer air, and there, near the centerpiece, a glittering rose gold phone, Sarah's. Its pink leather case caught the light. Marianne's eyes narrowed. No one else was around. She crossed the room in measured steps, not rushed, not panicked, like a woman retrieving a napkin, but when she reached the phone, her hand hovered above it. The air electric. This is madness, something in her warned. But another voice, stronger, older, fed up, said, "No, this is justice." She picked it up. Her heart pounded as she slipped it into her purse, then placed a napkin where it had been, folding it neatly like nothing had happened. She didn't know what her next move would be, but she knew she had shifted the ground beneath them. Power didn't always come from shouting. Sometimes it came from silence, from a single calculated act. She moved to the far corner of the room and stood near the window, her back to the curtain. Outside, Sarah was still talking, holding court with two of her friends, a glass of rosé in her hand, unbothered, unchecked. Marianne watched her closely, waiting, and then the moment arrived. Sarah reached into her bag, paused, frowned, dug deeper, looked around. Her smile faltered, just a crack. Marianne felt the corner of her own mouth twitch, not in cruelty, but in satisfaction. So this is what it feels like to be noticed, she thought. Sarah patted down her seat, checked the table, then turned sharply to Chris. Marianne couldn't hear the words, but the agitation was obvious. Chris shrugged. Sarah's voice rose a decibel. Her friends leaned in. Marianne clutched the purse tighter. The phone inside felt like a live coal. For years she'd let herself be pushed aside, treated like background noise, dismissed like a superstition. But now, for the first time, Sarah was off balance, not in control, not smirking. She'll look everywhere, Marianne thought. She'll panic when the texts start piling up, when she can't control the narrative anymore, when she doesn't know who's watching. It wasn't just about the scarf. It was about every missed call, every ignored invitation, every jab disguised as a joke, every moment Sarah had turned Marianne's own son into a stranger. This wasn't vengeance. It was a signal. You don't get to rewrite me. From outside, the mood began to shift. Sarah paced. Chris looked concerned. Someone pointed toward the house. Marianne stepped back into the shadows. Let them wonder. Let them guess. Because now she wasn't the woman forgotten at the table. She was the one they'd be searching for. As Sarah turned to the house, frustration hardening in her face, Marianne held her breath. The storm was coming, and for the first time she was ready to meet it head-on. The frustration was building, and I could feel the shift of control in my favor. Sarah didn't realize the power she was about to lose. From the hallway, Marianne could see everything. Sarah's agitation bubbling just beneath her perfect exterior, her voice tightening as she clutched her bag to her chest and rifled through it again. It was here, Sarah hissed to no one in particular. I left it right here. A few guests exchanged glances but said nothing. Marianne saw Mark, her nephew, pause with his wineglass, halfway to his lips. Sophie, her cousin from out of town, shifted uneasily on her heel. No one moved to help. No one said a word. Marianne lingered behind the kitchen archway, still and calm, the purse resting quietly on the counter beside her, the phone now sealed in a Ziploc bag, and resting in the freezer behind the frozen peas, was only a few feet away. But its absence felt like an earthquake shaking the garden party's carefully constructed charm. She watched Sarah pace like a lioness in heels, anger flaring sharper with each step. Chris stood awkwardly near the buffet table, sipping his drink like he hoped it would make him disappear. His silence was the deepest cut. She's accusing someone now, Marianne whispered to herself, and she was right. Sarah's voice rose again. Has anyone seen my phone? It's not a joke. Someone took it. Still, no one spoke. Marianne saw the discomfort ripple outward. Guests adjusted their ties, shifted their weight, looked at their plates like answers might be hiding in the hors d'oeuvres. And still Chris said nothing. Sarah's tone turned sharp. I swear to God, if someone thinks this is funny, it's not funny, Marianne murmured to herself, her hands folded. But it is justice. For every time she'd been spoken over, for every time she'd been dismissed, this wasn't just a prank, it was a reclamation. Outside, Sarah gripped the edge of the buffet table, jaw clenched, her fingers were white. Sophie finally stepped forward. Maybe it just got moved, she said gently, trying to calm the storm. Sarah turned on her. Don't coddle me, it didn't just walk away. Mark cleared his throat, but whatever words he had, he swallowed them. Marianne stepped into the kitchen fully, still hidden from sight, and leaned back against the counter. The hum of the freezer behind her was soothing. She could almost taste it, that delicate shift in power. Not violent, just present. Sarah stormed inside, heels clacking on the hardwood. Marianne stepped aside, pretending to rinse her hands at the sink. Something wrong? She asked, tone sweet. My phone's missing. Sarah snapped, not even looking at her. Marianne tilted her head. Did you check the kitchen? Sarah opened drawers, cupboards, the trash. Then she swung open the freezer door and froze. Her fingers hovered just above the bag of frozen corn. There it was, the rose gold shimmer, encased in plastic, sitting on a shelf like a trophy. She stared at it. A long, cold silence filled the kitchen. Behind her, Marianne didn't move, didn't smile, just watched. Sarah reached in slowly, pulled the phone from its frozen tomb. Water clung to the case, condensation thick and gleaming. For a long time she didn't say a word. She met Marianne's eyes. And that was when Marianne knew, Sarah knew, not just who did it, but why. Marianne offered the faintest of smiles, not smug, not cruel, just steady. Sarah opened her mouth, but the words didn't come, not yet, because whatever Sarah was about to say, it wouldn't be loud enough to drown out what she was starting to feel, the unraveling of control. Her face twisted with rage. She was ready to lash out. But I wasn't backing down anymore. Sarah stood with the freezer door still open, frost clinging to the sides, her rose gold phone dripping in her hand like a symbol of her unraveling. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. You, she hissed, stepping toward Marianne. You did this. Marianne didn't flinch. She stood beside the sink, hands dry, scarf still tucked neatly at her collarbone. I didn't think you'd miss it, she said quietly. You miss so much else. Sarah blinked. You think this is funny? Embarrassing me? In front of everyone? No, Marianne said, but now maybe you know what it feels like to be dismissed. The words landed like a slap. Sarah's jaw clenched, her eyes narrowing. You humiliated me. No, Marianne corrected. I gave you a taste of what you serve me every time you speak. Voices stirred outside the kitchen. Footsteps approached. Mark peeked in. Then Sophie hovering just behind him. Chris entered last, his face pale, uncertain. Sarah turned to him like backup. She stole my phone. Chris looked from Sarah to Marianne. Is that true? I moved it. Marianne replied, to make a point. Sarah laughed, bitter and high. A point. This is psychotic. Chris ran a hand through his hair. Mom, that was unnecessary. Marianne's stomach tightened, but she kept her gaze steady. Unnecessary. So was Sarah ripping the scarf off my neck in front of our family. But you said nothing then. That was different, he said too quickly. Marianne took a step forward. No, Christopher. It was exactly the same. You've stood by while she chips away at everything this family was built on. Our stories, our traditions. Me. Chris looked away. Mark and Sophie exchanged a glance, but stayed silent. I've tried to make peace, Marianne said, to be quiet, polite, but I'm done shrinking so your wife feels taller. Sarah's laugh was brittle now. Oh, so you're the victim. I'm the woman who built Sunday dinners, school projects, emergency pickups and late-night talks, Marianne replied, and I'm not going to disappear quietly. Chris sighed. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, she said, stepping closer. Sarah crossed her arms. So what now? You want a medal for hiding my phone? I want respect, Marianne said, and you don't get to keep mocking my history and expect my silence. For a beat, no one spoke. Then Chris looked at her. Tired. Mom. Look, I've backed Sarah because we both agree some of the old ways need to change. Marianne froze. What? Chris exhaled. The traditions. The stories, they don't resonate with us the way they do with you. We thought modernizing things was the right call. Something in Marianne's chest cracked. So you knew what she was doing? He didn't answer. I thought you were just blind to it, she said softly. I didn't realize you'd chosen it. Mark stepped forward slightly, but Marianne lifted her hand. She didn't want comfort. Not Sophie looked pained. Marianne held her eyes on her son. I would have let go. I was letting go. But you let her turn this into a purge. Of me. Of everything before her. Chris looked down. Sarah leaned against the counter, smugness seeping back into her stand. But Marianne wasn't done. You've both made it clear where I stand. I just hope, one day, when you're reaching for your own past, it's not already erased. She turned to leave, heart thudding, wondering how many pieces of herself she could still recover, and whether her son would ever be among them. The rift between us was deeper than I realized, but I wasn't going to apologize for standing up for myself. The tension didn't evaporate after the kitchen confrontation. It thickened, hung in the air like smoke. Marianne walked out into the garden again, not because she wanted to rejoin the celebration, but because she refused to hide. She wasn't the one who needed to shrink anymore. Some guests avoided her gaze, others gave her tight, polite smiles. Mark nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a soldier acknowledging a general. It wasn't solidarity, not quite, but it was something. The fairy lights above seemed dimmer, or maybe Marianne was just seeing things more clearly. Chris and Sarah remained inside. Their absence screamed louder than their voices had. Marianne stood by the stone planter near the roses. She traced one leaf with a fingertip, grounding herself. Her heart had calmed, but the bruises inside her hadn't. Not from Sarah, from her son. You chose this, she had said, and he had. Years of sidelong comments, sidelined holidays, invitations that felt more like formalities than warmth. It wasn't Sarah's influence alone. It was Chris's silent permission. Thought I might find you here. Sophie's voice came from behind her, soft but steady. Marianne turned. Needed air, she murmured. Sophie joined her, eyes scanning the crowd. It's strange, isn't, how everyone claims family is everything, until standing by one of them becomes inconvenient. Marianne gave a faint smile. You always did see more than you let on. They stood in silence for a beat, the buzz of conversation muffled by distance. I'm sorry, Sophie said, for all the times I didn't speak up. You weren't the only one, Marianne replied, but I'm not angry anymore, just awake. Sophie hesitated. Chris, he's been different for a while, closed off, defensive. It's not just about Sarah. Marianne's breath caught. What do you mean? Sophie shook her head. I don't know, but maybe it's not just about tradition. Maybe he's carrying something he hasn't told you. Marianne looked back toward the house, toward the flicker of movement inside. She didn't respond. I admire what you did, Sophie added. Takes guts to stand your ground when you're expected to just smile through it. Marianne swallowed. It wasn't courage, it was survival. Sophie gently touched her arm. Sometimes they're the same thing. After Sophie walked away, Marianne stayed by the roses. She thought about her childhood, how her mother had once told her, when a woman forgets her voice, the world forgets her too. She'd spent years softening her edges, being the peacemaker, the memory keeper, the one who brought the pie but never the confrontation. But now, she wouldn't apologize for protecting her root. Later, when she passed through the living room on her way to collect her bag, she overheard Sarah whispering to one of the guests. She's just old-fashioned, clings to things like they're sacred. Marianne didn't pause. She wasn't clinging, she was remembering, and reclaiming. In the car ride home, the silence was loud. She replayed everything. Chris's words, Sarah's fury, her own voice rising for the first time in years. You let her erase me. The ache was deep, but it no longer paralyzed her. Back in her small apartment, she hung the scarf carefully in the cedar closet. She brewed tea, sat in the chair by the window. No tears came. She thought of writing a letter, not to Sarah, not even to Chris, to herself, a record of what had happened, a declaration that she would no longer be edited out of her own story. Just as she reached for a pen, her phone buzzed. A message from Sophie. We should talk. I think there's more to Chris's silence than you realize. Marianne set the phone down, her thoughts swirling. Was her son just misled, or was there something deeper she had yet to see? Just when I thought all hope was lost, I received an apology from someone I least expected. Chris. The morning light filtered through pale curtains in Marianne's small kitchen. The air smelled of freshly brewed tea, and something less tangible, tentative peace. There was a soft knock. She turned. Chris stood there, uncertainty in his stance. His shirt was too neat, hands clasped in front of him, like a boy before pleading. I'm sorry, he began quietly, for what happened last night. Her heart skipped. He stepped inside as she gestured. The kitchen felt too small, too exposed, but strangely right. I wanted to talk, he said, voice gentle, to explain what I couldn't last night. Marianne closed her purse, folding the scarf across her lap. He paused, then took a breath. I've been torn, he said slowly, between what Sarah believed, modernizing, letting traditions fade, and what I knew about you, your history, your sacrifices, your stories. She kept her face calm, but inside, a storm threatened to break. I realize now I minimized what mattered to you. I didn't defend you. I stood silent while she belittled traditions you hold dear. Chris's face creased. I'm sorry for that, Mom. His apology was quiet, but powerful. Marianne searched his eyes, looking for sincerity or another silence. It's not enough anymore, she whispered. Words. He nodded, pain lining his gaze. I know, but I hope it's a start. There was a moment of fragile stillness, the clink of a spoon, the hum of the fridge. I don't know if that's enough, Marianne admitted, voice soft. Chris swallowed. I'll prove it. I want to, if you'll let me try. Across the small kitchen, the emotional distance felt measurable. Marianne exhaled slowly. I want to believe that. He touched her hand briefly, lightly, cautiously. I won't let you down. She nodded, more to herself than to him. They need to know history doesn't vanish when you modernize, she said. It builds context. Chris looked down. I understand. Just then Sophie appeared in the doorway, face apologetic. Marianne turned, surprised. Sophie stopped by after I left, Chris said. She wanted to see you too. Sophie entered, voice gentle. Chris was right. I stayed silent too long. Marianne nodded, heart softening. Sophie had seen it all, the quiet erasures. Thank you, she said. Hearing that matters. Sophie wiped her hand on her skirt. I realize now that quiet support sometimes means just noticing. I should have spoken sooner. Marianne gave a small smile. Notice is enough to begin. They stood in uneasy silence again. Together, Chris cleared his throat. I'll go on about the after-party arrangements today, but later, I'd like to help you with something. A family album, your handwriting by the photos, stories in your words. Marianne blinked. She hadn't expected that. Tears pricked. That sounds nice, she said softly. He gave a tentative smile. Real, when you're ready. Sophie lingered. Your traditions, they're not irrelevant. They're roots. Marianne touched her own scarf at her collarbone. Sometimes roots feel heavy, but they're what keep trees standing, Sophie said. Marianne looked between them. Two allies she hadn't expected. Still, she felt cautious, guarded. If what you say is true, she began slowly. Then I need time. Chris nodded. I understand. Sophie emptied her hands. Whatever you need. They left in silence, leaving Marianne with tea cooling between her palms. The morning stretched quiet. A new day, fragile and uncertain. Outside, sunlight glinted on the garden where so much had changed. Inside, Marianne realized that an apology wasn't an eraser, but perhaps a beginning. She set her cup down gently and thought about what trust might take to grow again. Because I knew hope without caution can't build anything lasting, but neither can silence. Chris's words felt genuine, but the distance between Chris and me still felt like an impossible gap. The apology lingered like incense, faint, warm, but too fragile to cover the smell of old wounds. Chris hadn't called again. He hadn't come by, and Marianne didn't chase instead. She baked. On Thursday morning, the kitchen filled with the scent of cardamom and cloves, the recipe her grandmother had whispered to her before prom night all those years ago. She turned on the radio, tied her apron, and lost herself in the rhythm of something she didn't have to By the time the cookies cooled, she'd already RSVP'd to a painting class at the community center. She hadn't touched a brush in years, but that was the point. She was touching everything again. Parts of herself she'd filed away between holidays and hospital visits. She'd thought family was her whole world, but now she remembered. She'd built that world from her own hands. The phone buzzed around noon. A text from Chris. Thinking of stopping by this weekend. Maybe bring Sarah. Marianne stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered. Then slowly, she typed, maybe just you. The reply didn't come. Later that day, while tending her tiny garden outside the apartment window, she caught herself humming. She hadn't realized how quiet her life had become, how much space was taken by tension. It wasn't that she no longer loved Chris. She just couldn't keep loving him into a shape that fit her pain. The weekend came and went. No knock, no call, Only a photo in the family group chat. Sarah smiling at some brunch table. Captioned, "Modern families do it best." Marianne didn't reply. She put her phone down and drove to the lake instead, the one she and her husband had picnicked at before their first child was born. She brought a thermos of tea and a notebook. Just her thoughts. Just her. When she returned, Sophie had left her a voicemail. "I think Sarah's trying to behave, but it's all surface. Chris, he's trying to balance everything, but I don't think he knows how." That night, Marianne sat by the window in silence, the scarf folded neatly beside her, untouched. She remembered the time she taught Chris to tie his shoe, how he kept trying to pull both laces at once, how she'd told him, "You have to give a little before you pull tight." Maybe he'd forgotten, or maybe life with Sarah taught him to tighten first, ask questions later. The days moved forward. Painting class, a trip with Elaine to the botanical gardens, a card from Mark, thanking her for being the only adult in the family who'd ever talked to him like he mattered. Her world had widened, but the ache remained. Not loud, just there. On Wednesday evening, Chris finally called. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. He said, "I miss when things were easy." Marianne listened, then replied, "They were never easy. You just never noticed the weight I was carrying." He went quiet. She let the silence speak. As they hung up, she didn't cry, didn't tremble, but she also didn't feel relief. She sat in the dim light of her living room, thinking of all the women she'd descended from, all the women she might still become. Sarah would likely always be a thorn. Chris would likely always try to please everyone, until the seams frayed again. But Marianne, she was done stitching herself back together for anyone else's comfort. As she watched the moon rise through her window, Marianne asked herself a question she'd avoided for too long. Was it time to stop waiting for her family to come back to her, and simply move forward without them? Just when I thought I had everything figured out, I learned something so shocking that it completely changed my perspective on the entire family. The afternoon sky had just begun to dim when Marianne's phone buzzed on the windowsill. She glanced at it, expecting Sophie or Elaine, but the name glowing on the screen froze her. Peter Dalton, Chris's best friend since college, the one who used to call her second mom. She hadn't heard from him in years. She answered cautiously, "Peter." His voice was quiet, unsteady. "Marianne, I know this is unexpected, but I didn't know who else to call." She stepped away from the window, heart thrumming. "What's going on?" Peter hesitated, then exhaled. "I think you deserve to know what Chris and Sarah are planning." The next 5 minutes cracked something inside her she didn't even know was holding. Sarah was in debt. Deep. Had been for years. Credit cards, business loans, private borrowing. Not just recklessness, deceit. And Chris, he hadn't just known. He'd been helping her hide it. Peter, uncomfortable but honest, explained everything. "They've been taking money from the shared family account stuff you contributed to, back when you helped with the down payment. Chris used that to help cover some of Sarah's personal loans." Marianne's knees buckled slightly. She sank into the nearest chair. Peter's voice softened. "That's not even the worst part. They've been talking about selling the family house, quietly, behind your back. They're working with a realtor already trying to flip it before the new year." Marianne couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. "They want to leave town," Peter continued. "Start over. Cut ties. Chris thinks it's the cleanest way to deal with the fallout. Sarah thinks your family's legacy is dragging them down." There was a long pause. "I shouldn't be the one telling you this," Peter said, guilt thick in his tone. "But you didn't deserve to be left in the dark." Marianne barely whispered, "Why now?" "I heard them on the phone this morning," he said. "It was the way Sarah left, the way Chris didn't stop her when she mocked your scarf again. That broke me." She couldn't remember how she ended the call, only that she did. Only that her body felt heavier than ever before. The house, the scarf, the traditions, all dismissed. But it was Chris who gutted her the most. Because for all of Sarah's venom, Marianne had clung to the belief that her son had a line he wouldn't cross. Now she saw he'd already crossed it. She stared at the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp waves. Memories flickered in and out. Chris at 5, clapping his hands as she pulled pies from the oven. Chris at 16, standing awkwardly in his prom tux while she pinned his boutonniere. Chris at 30, asking if she could babysit so he and Sarah could get a night out. Had it all been slipping away this whole time? Was she the only one holding on? She stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. She moved through the apartment like a shadow, into the closet, pulled down the dusty photo box. There was the deed, the original joint paperwork, the shared signatures, her equity, slowly siphoned in secret. She pressed her palm against the wood grain of the cabinet, not for the first time, but for the last. Marianne understood what betrayal tasted like when it came with your child's name on it. By evening, she sat alone in the dark, phone in her lap, Peter's words echoing. She had two choices now: pretend or confront. Chris had once asked for her blessing. Now she had to ask for answers. The lights across the street flickered on. Another family eating dinner, laughing, and Marianne sat there, her fingers brushing the cool ceramic of her mug, untouched tea now cold. She pulled her scarf from its hook, tied it slowly, deliberately, not for ceremony, for arm, and with one final glance at the silent phone, she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I get the truth. No more illusions." Then she picked up her coat and stepped into the night, headed straight for her son. Chris had no idea that I knew everything, but when the truth came out, there was no turning back. Marianne found Chris under the soft glow of porch lights the next evening. His face was familiar and foreign, drawn tight with guilt and looming regret. She told herself she had to be steady. She had to speak. "Chris," she said, voice low but clear. "We need to talk." He stood at the top step, shifting his weight, as if anticipating how to block her words. She handed him the phone. "Did you ever finish that closing for the house?" His jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" Marianne let her gaze slide from the phone to his face. "Peter called me. I know about Sarah's debts. I know you were using the family account. My name was on that account." He blinked, briefly, then shook his head. "That's not true, Chris." She breathed. "I have the statements, the withdrawals, the realtor's emails. I know about the deed transfer plans." She pulled a folder from her coat. "Here." He looked down, eyes widening, confronted by proof he couldn't deny. The wind rustled. The night pressed in. "My son," she whispered. "You chose her over me." His shoulders sagged. He exhaled slowly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." She stepped off the porch into his space, leaning on the edge of the railing. "Explain it then." He rubbed his temples. There was pressure. She raised an eyebrow. "From Sarah." He hesitated. Marianne's heart caught. He nodded. "She said tradition was a prison, that I was living a life designed for someone else." That quiet confession hurt more than any shout. "So you stole from me. You stole our history," she said softly. "Because you felt trapped." Chris's voice cracked. "I thought, if we sold the house, paid the debts, started fresh, we could be happy. Just us." Marianne closed her eyes. "You could have been happy with me." He looked her in the eye. "I know I hurt you." She swallowed, pain twisting. "You didn't just hurt me. You erased me." He shook his head. "I was caught between two worlds, her future and your past. I was terrible at balancing both." Marianne grabbed his hand. "You were not balancing. You were hiding." He stared at their hand. The silence folded between them. "I know what it means to carry legacy," she said. "To feed it and protect it. I raised you on stories, traditions, quiet sacrifices. To give you roots." Chris closed his eyes. "I remember, clearly not enough." Tears glistened at the corners of his eyes. "Mom, you used my trust to undermine me." Marianne's voice trembled. "Fragile steel, to run from what we built." He swallowed again. "You're right." She let the air thicken between them. "I never stopped loving you," he said, "but I thought I needed more than what I'd been given." Marianne's throat tightened. "Those debts, that house, it wasn't just material difference. It was identity. You turned your back." Chris closed his eyes tightly. "I was selfish." "I'm sorry." Her vision blurred. Regret and anger warred inside. "I don't know if that can be fixed," she whispered. He nodded. "I understand. But you can try," she said. "If you want." He looked at her, vulnerability etched deep. "I have to." She stepped back, processing every word, every betrayal, every apology. The night air felt colder now. "You may have asked for forgiveness," she said finally, "but you need to earn it." Chris nodded again. They stood together under the porch light, with nothing to bind them, but truth and regret. Marianne looked out toward the empty street, faint memories floating. Chris's first bike ride, the kitchen he built a fort beneath, The phone call she'd dreamt he'd never make. And now the person on that porch had shattered the trust she thought was unbreakable. She faced him again. I want you to understand who I was naming this house for. He nodded, swallowing. And understand who you almost erased. He left without a hug. She watched the pulse of the porch light flicker as he walked away. Alone again, still unsteady. Could Chris truly rebuild the trust he had broken with me? Or has this betrayal created a chasm that's impossible to cross? Despite Chris's apology, the rift in the family was growing. Every interaction felt less genuine than the last. Marianne looked at the calendar on her fridge. Appointments, tea dates, art classes, no family events. For now, that was enough. Chris visited a few times. Each visit felt like walking on glass. He brought flowers, sometimes a homemade dish, always a quiet hope etched behind his eyes. Marianne accepted the gestures, but none soothed the ache beneath the surface. She'd learned you can't patch betrayal with platitudes. At one Sunday gathering, Marianne showed up under her own She arrived early, slipped into the kitchen, and poured herself a cup of tea. When Sarah swept in, flawless and rehearsed, the sharp edges in her voice had faded, but not completely. Glad you came, Sarah said, tight-lipped. Everyone misses you. But the words sounded borrowed. Marianne smiled carefully. Thank you. Chris hovered. Marianne caught his eyes. They were jumbled with love, regret, and guilt. Without words, he seemed to promise he'd try harder. Marianne didn't believe him yet, but she allowed herself to hope. The lunch was polite, clinking glass small talk, but the atmosphere crackled with restraint. Sarah steered conversations away from Marianne's interests. No family stories, no tradition talk. Marianne sensed carefully placed blinds, eyes diverting to flowers, to candles, to sun. After dessert, Sophie found Marianne near the guest bedroom, dabbing at her teacup with a napkin. You didn't have to come, she said gently. Marianne sighed. I thought I still wanted family. Her voice cracked a little. But every moment I feel more erased. Sophie put a hand on her shoulder. It's not your fault. You tried. Friendship had become Marianne's refuge. She spent more evenings with Elaine, Alice and Margot, women who knew her history, her traditions, her peace of mind. One afternoon, Marianne joined a pottery workshop, molding clay with her hands, making and letting go. When she left, the heaviness in her chest had softened. Chris called that evening. He said he'd dropped by earlier with a letter. Local real estate agent feedback. Miss Stone thought the house had sentimental value, but low market demand in the current climate. They'd reconsider the timing. Marianne listened, surprised. And you? He hesitated. I don't want to make decisions without you. She swallowed. Thank you. They spoke a little longer than usual. The conversation felt real, not hopeful, but honest. Later, Marianne checked her phone. A message from Sophie. Stop shrinking. You're not nobody. It made her think. Serenity felt strange, but possible. The weekend, Chris returned with a packet of photos. They were of Marianne decades ago, hosting holiday dinners, teaching grandchildren to bake pies. He gave them to her carefully, as if the weight of memory might break the glass frame. She said, you'd like these, he offered. Marianne nodded, emotion too deep for speaking. Still, Marianne stayed guarded. These moments didn't erase the secret decisions, the hidden debts, the truth that he nearly erased her. Sarah's subtle jabs continued. At brunch, she remarked, half loud, I thought Grandma's scarf was part of her vintage act. Marianne ignored it. During later events, Chris sometimes faltered. Diane, Marianne's friend, noticed. He looks torn. Marianne couldn't say if that was good or painful. In those silences, Marianne reminded herself, identity can't crumble if you hold on. She kept painting, baking, writing letters, not to others, but to herself, recording small joys. First rosebuds in spring, a new classmate calling her by her first name, but the pattern held. An apology offered, a gesture made, followed by more distance. One bright morning, Chris stopped by with half his glass of coffee. He read Marianne's face before she spoke. Do you think, maybe one day we can repair things? She looked at him. Possibly, she said, but it has to be without sacrificing who I am. He nodded slowly. I understand. It felt honest for once. Later, Marianne told herself she no longer needed to wait for family to reclaim her. She didn't need permission she wrote in her journal, closing the entry with a question she hadn't dared ask aloud before. Should I cut my losses and move on, or try one last time to make something whole? Her pen hovered. Behind her, sunlight moved across the gutta percha floors, touching the scarf she laid over her chair. No longer just armor but history and hope. What path will I choose? And can I trust the one I once believed in? Chris's apology felt genuine, but how could I trust someone who had betrayed me so deeply? Chris stood on the doorstep of Marianne's apartment that evening, his posture hesitant, eyes unreadable in the soft porch light. She'd agreed to see him after all. Hope flickers even in the deepest cracks. Mom, he began, voice wearily familiar. Please let me speak. Inside, they sat at her small kitchen table. Marianne folded her scarf neatly beside her. Chris placed a worn envelope in front of her, then clasped his hands together, struggling not to break. I owe you an explanation, he said after a long pause. I've been ashamed for months, not just of what I did, but what I was afraid to lose. Marianne listened as he confessed how the pressure to support Sarah had twisted into fear of losing his marriage, his future. I was terrified of disappointing both of you, he admitted, so I chose convenience over clarity. And I lied. Her heart squeezed. The ache she'd carried for weeks trembled behind her ribcage. I realize now that silence was betrayal. Chris continued. Every withdrawal, every real estate email I deleted, it was me choosing a fantasy over the truth. Marianne felt the sting. Truth had come too late. She studied his face, tachyon regret in his eyes. But he added quietly, I'm done hiding. I've broken off the plan with Sarah. The realtor contract is void. I've transferred funds back into your name. Everything is transparent. She nodded slowly. The words were soft, but their meaning was seismic. He swallowed. I was wrong for thinking our traditions were outdated, for treating our history like something to leave behind. I want to reintegrate them. With your help. With inclusion, not erasure. Marianne's breath. The offer sounded vulnerable, fragile but real. Chris reached across the table. I'm asking, can I prove it? Can I rebuild this trust? Silence settled. The kettle whistled. Her scarf lay still beside her. He sat quietly, waiting. Finally, Marianne exhaled. Words are gentle, but promises are better when backed by action. If this is real, you'll show me. Chris nodded, relief mingling with remorse. I will. Later, as he stood to leave, Sophie appeared at the doorway. She offered a fragile smile. That took courage, she said softly. Marianne nodded, but still felt cautious. Over the next days, Chris acted deliberately. He didn't flood her with affection. Instead, he sent clipped messages, updates on planning a family brunch with Elaine, or inquiries about which heirloom dishes she'd like at future gatherings. It wasn't grand. It felt patient. Marianne, meanwhile, crept back into life with small breaths of joy. Album scraps, old recipes, quiet photo evenings with friends who made her feel more anchored than she had in years. She received one unexpected text from Chris. Would you like to go through my acceptance speech for my daughter's graduation? I want to include your family stories. Again, no pressure. A gesture. A bridge. She replied, yes, and I'll bring photos. That afternoon, he arrived with a stack of photographs from Marianne's past. She spread them on her table. Family portraits, holiday baking, campsite sunrise smiles. Chris paused. I remember how you told me stories about them, as if they were alive in the room. Marianne's throat squeezed. Nostalgia burned bright, but she held firm. They were, and they still are. He nodded, understanding her pause. But not everything changed. At a small family gathering a week later, Sarah hovered. Marianne watched quiet sparks of familiar tension. Sarah made a casual remark about photo books being tacky. Marianne simply smiled, ignoring it. Chris saw the moment. Later that night, he called Marianne. I'm sorry she said that. His voice was hushed. It won't happen again. Marianne took a breath. Thank you, she said. That matters. There were still cracks in the quiet, moments where Chris seemed pulled between worlds. Sarah's voice hinting at impatience, and Marianne's quiet strength, echoing in his mind. Each day, Marianne weighed her trust. She didn't expect miracles. She expected consistency. One afternoon, Chris knocked and handed her a framed print of their old family home, with a note, whenever you're ready, let's bring those stories back here. She accepted it. Tears welled. But this time pain wasn't tangled in them. It was determination. On her couch that evening, Marianne reflected, apologies can open doors, but only actions keep them open. She looked at the scarf, draped over her chair, history, armor, identity. Would rebuilding be possible? Maybe not in a single gesture, maybe over time. But for the first time since she'd tied that scarf around her neck, it felt like someone saw the woman it belonged to. Chris's apology and gentle actions gave her reason to hope, but only time would prove if a future could be rebuilt, or if the chasm was too wide to ever cross. Sophie's words made me realize that I was still holding on to old grudges, preventing myself from healing. The afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains as Marianne and Sophie sat in her living room, each nursing a cup of chamomile tea. Outside, magnolia petals fell silently. The quiet between them carried weight. Sophie had come at Marianne's invitation, though her presence felt both unexpected and necessary. She set her cup down and looked carefully at her aunt. I've been thinking about last night, Sophie began, voice soft. About Sarah. Marianne raised an eyebrow. She expected more questions, not empathy. She's not just cruel, Sophie said. I think she feels displaced, unsure, and rather than cry for help, she lashes out. Marianne's brows furrowed. Sophie continued, when she mocked your scarf, I saw someone terrified of not belonging, and for all her anger, she's never been welcomed fully, not into the stories, not into the quiet rhythms of Sunday dinners, or Aunt Elaine's family photos. Marianne's throat tightened. She'd always thought of Sarah as the intruder, but Sophie's words nudged something bigger, the possibility that Sarah was spilling hurt, not hatred. You're seeing it differently, Marianne whispered. I am, Sophie replied. I once felt pushed aside too, and it changed everything. How I spoke, how I stayed quiet. I see Sarah making the same mistakes. She offered her hand. Maybe we can rebuild on your terms. Marianne studied Sophie's face, truth tinted with hope. They sat in silence for a moment. The clock ticked. Petals continued to drift outside. I've been clutching grief like a talisman, Marianne admitted, because it felt safe. Hurt feels true, easier than hope. But I'm tired of being a relic. Sophie nodded. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's letting the anger lose its grip. That night, Marianne folded her scarf and placed it on her dresser. She didn't need it for armor anymore. She needed it for history. Something shared, not stolen. The next morning, Marianne walked into a soft kitchen light. She poured tea, called Elaine for a quiet conversation about Easter traditions, how to celebrate them with subtle adjustments, if necessary. She mentioned Sophie's insight, how she was seeing Sarah as someone scared, not spiteful. Elaine listened, then offered help planning a mix of old rituals and potential new ones to welcome Sarah, but only if Sarah was willing. Marianne reflected on that as she stirred her tea. Forgiveness felt like the first step, but boundaries would come next. Later that afternoon, Marianne arrived at Chris and Sarah's for a small family gathering. Tea, cake, gentle laughter. Sarah greeted her at the door, nervous but civil. Marianne, she said, voice careful. I've been thinking about the scarf and how you felt. Marianne's chest tightened. She could walk away, but she remembered Sophie's words. She searched Sarah's eyes. She saw something fragile. That scarf belongs to my grandmother, Marianne said quietly. To me, but it doesn't have to divide us. Sarah swallowed. I was wrong, she said. I never understood, and I'm sorry. The words landed. They didn't erase the past, but they created space. Sophie stepped from the kitchen and offered Marianne a glass of water. For the first time, the atmosphere felt real, hopeful, authenticity mingling with cautious acceptance. Chris stood near the doorway, watching. Relief softened the lines in his face. They sat down at the table. Conversation gently turned to planning a combined family gathering for Charity Week, suggesting incorporating both old recipes and Sarah's favorite contributions. It wasn't perfect. Sarah stumbled through details. Her voice faltered when asked about grandmother's arugula pie. Marianne offered to teach her. Sarah accepted. It felt meaningful, roots grafting into new growth. Still, Marianne stayed guarded. She kept the memory of betrayal within her folds, but she also felt a stirring, a blossoming possibility that relationships could be restored, not just preserved. That evening, Marianne tucked in early. Sophie's text calendar reminder popped up. Remember, kindness is courageous. Marianne reopened the message and stared at it, tracing the letters with her thumb. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded the scarf quietly and placed it back across her chair. No longer armor, but a banner she still believed in. Sophie's insight had cracked the door. The question remained, could Marianne forgive Sarah for the damage done, or would Sarah's actions always cast a shadow she couldn't shake? The air between them had shifted, but only time would tell. Could forgiveness bloom where hurt once cast cold shadows? I thought everything was finally settling down, but a revelation about Chris's finances turned my world upside down again. The accountant's office smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee. Marianne sat rigid in the leather chair, long after the visit should have ended. Across from her, Mr. Patel cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't want to alarm you, but Mrs. Dalton's records don't tell the half." Marianne's chest tightened. "You know Chris has been helping Sarah with debt," he continued. "But that debt wasn't hers alone. It wasn't just loans or practical costs. Chris has been borrowing." Marianne, aggressively, to cover mistakes, lifestyle shortfalls, investments gone wrong. "He's in deeper than you know." She pressed her fingers to her temple, breath shallow. How long?" "Years," he replied. "Monthly transfers from a joint account, credit applications you're not on. He's maintaining two realities." Marianne closed her eyes. Her hands trembled. This wasn't just Sarah's mistake. It was her son. She had thought betrayal lay in erasure. Now she understood. It was also in deception, built over years. Mr. Patel slid a folder across the desk. Unauthorized loan contracts, lines of credit tied to home equity, statements showing Chris paying off personal debts, all funded from accounts bearing Marianne's name or joint ownership. "This is beyond misuse," he said. "It borders on identity exploitation." Marianne felt as though she'd been kicked in the gut, not by a liar, but by the child she raised. Back home, she sifted through the papers at her kitchen table, humming Kettle Ignored. My son," she thought. This pain wasn't Sarah's alone anymore. It was mine now too. That evening, Sophie knocked gently. She saw the folder on the table. She read Marianne's face, hollow, but burning. Sophie offered tea, and together they processed the new betrayal. Marianne crying out for strength. "He wasn't just caught between loyalty and fear," Sophie said. "He was failing both sides." The silence between them echoed. Marianne slept badly. When dawn came, she made the decision she missed the night before. She would confront Chris again tonight. She prepared dinner, each dish a memory. Her mother's roast chicken, Sunday mashed potatoes. She set the table with intention. Tradition wasn't just pain. It was what she once built. Chris rang the bell at dusk. He carried papers of his own, balance sheets, apology drafts, his own trembling confession. She didn't speak until he did. "I didn't want you to see this. Not you." He laid his documents down, the stark reality before them. "I'm in over my head," he said. "I messed up. I thought I could fix it before it got to you." Marianne stared at him. The man she raised was cracking. "I borrowed your trust, and more," he continued. "I planned to sell the house to salvage it, but I didn't want to tell you because I was ashamed." Her voice trembled. "So you borrowed from your mother, from her legacy, because you couldn't stay afloat." He nodded, unable to look. "You weren't helping Sarah," she whispered. "You were drowning, and letting her drown with you." He looked up. "I know. I'm sorry." She swallowed pain and whispered. "You've dragged history into this chaos." He exhaled. "I know. I've pushed everything I cherished into the void." She looked at their years together. His childhood, his promises. There was love, but there was devastation too. Can you rebuild trust after erasing it financially? Emotionally? She asked. Chris's voice was raw, not with empty promises. Only time, and proof. She nodded. Tears surfaced. "Then you'll have to earn both." They spoke long into the night, truths spilling that left everything fragile, yet honest, like broken glass being gathered, piece by painful piece. When he departed, Marianne placed one folded napkin on the table. Another stayed held in her hands. Proof that forgiveness would need patience, boundaries, and perhaps new definitions. As the house grew dark around her, she wondered, if betrayal cut so deep, can repair ever reach its center? Chris's deception wasn't just about Sarah's debts anymore. It was about his own failures, manipulated through layers of secrecy. Trust wasn't broken. It was shattered. Could Marianne ever sew those pieces back together? Section 14. The final confrontation with Chris. Chris's confession was hard to swallow, but I needed to face him, once and for all. The paneled living room was heavy with silence. Marianne sat on the edge of her couch, legs crossed, nerves coiled like piano wires. Evening light filtered through curtains. Chris fidgeted before her in the armchair, paper in one hand, guilt carved into his face. They'd talked once before, but now, this meeting felt like lifting the lid on a coffin. She needed closure, or clarity. I've reviewed everything, she began, soft but unwavering. The loans, the hidden credit lines. You used our name, and our home, to cover your mistakes. Chris swallowed. I know, I wasn't thinking straight. I let fear run my decisions. She leaned forward, eyes steady. Fear of losing what? Sarah, money, your image. He exhaled sharply. It was all of it. I messed up. I was drowning. Not because the world expected things from me, but because I couldn't deliver. Marianne saw the years in his face. The boy who once clung to her belt. The man now standing before her, broken, ashamed. You erased our trust, she continued, bit by bit. That's more than deception. It's betrayal rooted in desperation. Chris's voice cracked. My pride was backfiring. I didn't know how you'd react. I was ashamed of his failures more than afraid of loss. So I lied. Marianne pressed her lips together. She'd prepared for shock, never for this depth of regret. I'm sorry, he said, not just to you, but to our past, to everything you built. Silence settled. The contrast between his apology and her pain stretched wide. She sat up, slowly. I asked for proof before. Now I'm asking for more. Professional help, financial planning, and boundaries. Sarah cannot be involved in this again, until trust is rewoven. Chris nodded. Tears glistened. I already made appointments. I'm calling an accountant, separate from Sarah's influence. I'm canceling all unauthorized accounts, and removing her access. Marianne's chest tightened. Words mean something, but history means more. He leaned forward, voice trembling. I'll sign legal documents. I'll show you every bill, every withdrawal. I'll earn transparency. Even as her heart softened, she knew, trust is measured by consistency, not declarations. Chris continued, quieter now. I never stopped loving you, Mom. But I stopped believing you'd forgive me. She closed her eyes, feeling winded. I'm not done with us, she whispered. But I won't pretend we're okay. He nodded. I understand. They spoke for hours, assembling fragile plans, for repair, not grand gestures, but slow, methodical rebuilding. A shared ritual again. Dinner once a week, with family. Financial updates monthly. Sarah included only when boundaries are respected. When he stood to leave, Marianne touched his arm. You hurt me with secrets. Lies. You nearly took away our family's home, including me. But if you truly change, maybe, there's still something here. He blinked, hope and fear mingling. I'll prove it. She watched him walk into the night. Her home felt softer now. Not healed, but holding possibility. Later, she sat alone by the firelight, scarf folded neatly into her notebook, her writing pen poised above the page. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt resolute. This wasn't forgiveness yet. It was begin. Marianne closed the journal and whispered into the dark. Can I truly move forward with you, Chris? Or is this the year I finally accept that some relationships belong to the past? Marianne sat back, the scale of her choice pressing on her. Carry on rebuilding, or close the door. Family may be important, but I finally realized it's my happiness that comes first. Morning light spilled over Marianne's garden as she stood on the veranda, breathing in quiet freedom. The scarf lay folded on a chair, not armor but a reminder of roots she still carried with care. She sipped tea, petals, drifting on the breeze, her new rhythm, untouched by drama. In the last week, She'd planted lilies and raspberries where the roses once grew. Each sprout felt like soft rebellion, growth without apology. She'd also signed up for a travel group heading to Provence. In autumn, wine, lavender fields, mornings full of French conversation she'd never had. Her phone pinged with messages from Sophie and Mark, confirming dinner plans and art show visit. They'd become her sanctuary, the family she chose in middle age, not because she replaced blood, but because their loyalty was real. Chris called again, consistent updates on his therapy sessions, acknowledgement that Sarah's influence still swirled around his habit. He didn't ask permission for peace. Instead, he shared progress reports, how he paid back Marianne's account, how he asked Sarah to seek her own counseling, how they both promised no more secrets. She thanked him quietly, no celebration, no grand statement, just calm acknowledgement. She'd moved toward peace, but only on her terms. At a small cafe by the harbor, Marianne sketched boats on glassy water, focusing on textures, shapes, lines, light. A stranger commented on her style, genuine and surprising for someone so serene. She smiled, a real one. She realized she hadn't felt more herself in years. Back home, she unpacked the Provence brochure, circling sunsets and wineries. Adventure didn't scare her anymore. It thrilled her. Then Sunday came, brunch at Chris and Sarah's. Marianne declined. The invitation was softened, but felt loaded. She sent a note wishing well. Sarah replied, "We're trying, thank you." She wondered if words were enough anymore, or just gestures she no longer chased. Instead, she spent the day at the community center, teaching a beginner's baking class. Cinnamon buns and knot roll. The scent of rising dough, hands dusted in flour. Students smiled as they kneaded. Marianne realized she'd been kneading her own confidence back into being. That afternoon, Chris called again. He had printed family photos as he said he would, of Marianne hosting holiday dinners, teaching grandchildren card games, family treks. The real scrapbook was being reshaped this time with her in the center, but she chose not to go. Permission wasn't included in the gesture. She forgave but did not rejoin. Evening came. She sat with Sophie on the porch, wine and conversation drifting between them like ease. "You look lighter," Sophie said. Marianne nodded. "I feel that way too." They drank to new chapters, not endings, to turning pages they wrote themselves. Marianne packed for Provence that night. A suitcase light with linen dresses, sketchpad, and her grandmother's scarf tucked in a side pocket, not for tradition, but for quiet strength. Chris texted before bed, "Travel safe, Mum. We'll keep working, or however long it takes." She didn't reply immediately. She glanced at the screen, then placed it face down. Progress, yes, but her life needed no reminders of home, when home was what she felt inside. Next morning, she walked through her apartment, noting each small change, new prints on the walls, a vase from her late friend Margot, the diary she now kept, pages marked by hope, not fear. She paused at the window, the room softened by golden light. She inhaled deeply. No guilt, no doubt, just a clear sense of self. That day, she took a long walk by the lake, recorder in hand, talking into voice notes about what mattered. Family legacy, yes, but also laughter, warmth, independence. She paused at the bench where Chris once pushed her to listen. Memories floated, but weren't anchored in grief anymore. At dusk, she returned to finish packing, the scarf folded, the tickets in her purse. She put on lavender lotion, soft music. A note slipped to Sophie. "Flight's early. See you soon." She pressed send. Standing at the door, suitcase by her side, suitcase full of beginnings. As she turned off the light, she whispered into the empty room, "This is the year I stop waiting. I start living." And she stepped forward into that first day of her next chapter, eyes steady, and heart untethered. Where will this journey lead? Marianne didn't know, but for the first time, she was ready to define it herself.